Welcome 1970 quarter dollar to my YouTube channel. What if the change in your pocket could secretly make you a millionaire overnight? The kind of discovery that turns an ordinary afternoon into a story the world can't stop talking about. Because today we're diving into a coin so deceptively normal that millions of people have spent it without a second glance. Yet, a single rare version of the 1970p Washington quarter dollar has been whispered about in collector circles as a once-in-a-generation treasure, a coin born in an era of transition, mistakes, and silent mint anomalies. A coin that looks identical to millions of others but carries a secret that could rewrite your entire financial future. And by the time you hear the full story, you may never look at loose change the same way again. Within the first moments of this story, let's drop the bombshell that shocks even seasoned numismatists, because the highest estimated value tied to a legendary 1970p quarter error sits at an almost unbelievable $70 million. Yes, you heard that right. A small silver-colored coin no larger than your thumb that has been rumored, speculated, and fiercely hunted as a prize that could rival lottery winnings. And if you think that sounds impossible, stay with me to the very end, because not only will the truth behind that valuation make sense, but the next coins coming up in this series are even more mysterious, even more controversial, and even more likely to be hiding in places you'd never expect. So don't go anywhere. To understand why the 1970p quarter dollar has ignited such obsession, we have to rewind to the late 1960s and early 1970s. A chaotic moment in U.S. coinage history when the mint was still reeling from the removal of silver from circulating coins. Collectors were hoarding anything that looked unusual, and the Philadelphia Mint was striking massive quantities of quarters to keep up with demand, often under intense pressure and with experimental dies, altered hub designs, and rushed quality control. And it was inside this environment that some of the most legendary mint errors in American history were quietly born. The standard 1970p quarter was supposed to be a copper-nickel-clad coin, with no mint mark, featuring John Flanagan iconic Washington design, and in ordinary condition it's worth face value. But the stories that drive collectors wild revolve around a handful of pieces believed to have been struck on the wrong planchets, experimental metal compositions, or with die pairings that were never meant to exist, including quarters struck on leftover 1941 Canadian silver quarter planchets, transitional silver-clad hybrids, and ultra-rare proof-style strikes that somehow escaped into circulation. And these are the kinds of mistakes that don't just add a few dollars of value, they create legends. One of the most famous rumors tied to the 1970p quarter involves a coin struck on a silver planchet intended for a foreign issue, instantly making it heavier, sharper in detail, and dramatically different under scientific testing. And while only a handful have ever been confirmed, whispers persist that more are still out there, sitting unnoticed in old jars, estate collections, or inherited boxes of coins where nobody ever thought to check the weight or metal composition. Collectors chase these quarters not just because of money, but because of what they represent: a tangible mistake frozen in time, a moment when the most powerful minting institution in the world slipped up and accidentally created a unicorn. And when one of these pieces appears at auction, even rumors of authenticity can send prices soaring as bidders compete not just for ownership, but for bragging rights. Auction lore tells stories of a 1970p quarter appearing quietly at a regional show, dismissed at first as altered, only to later be authenticated and trigger private offers that escalated into the tens of millions. Not because the metal itself was worth that much, but because elite collectors understood the implications, that owning such a coin meant owning a chapter of American mint history that might never be repeated. And here's where the fear of missing out really kicks in, because unlike museum-locked rarities, some 1970p quarters were released into circulation. Meaning this isn't a fantasy locked behind glass. This is a coin that could have passed through vending machines, cash registers, and pockets. A coin that could still be hiding in your house right now, and most people would spend it without realizing its fortune. The hunt becomes even more intense when you learn what collectors look for: subtle doubling on the lettering, unusually sharp rims, incorrect reading patterns, mismatched die alignment, and most importantly, weight anomalies that suggest a non-standard planchet, details so small that only the trained eye or a curious mind would ever notice, which is why so many believe undiscovered examples still exist. As the years passed, the legend of the $70 million quarter grew, fueled by private sales, non-disclosure agreements, and elite collectors who prefer secrecy over publicity. And every time a new era coin is authenticated from that era, attention snaps back to 1970 like a magnet, because if one miracle happened, why not another? And just when you think this story couldn't get more intense, remember this is only the beginning, because the next coin we're about to explore comes from a different mint, a different set of errors, and a completely different mystery that has stunned even veteran graders. So keep watching, because what's coming next might change the way you search through coins forever. Before we move on, take one more second to imagine the emotional impact of discovering something like this, the moment you realize that a quarter you nearly spent could secure your family's future. And that's exactly why collectors never stop searching, because history has proven again and again that the rarest treasures are often hiding in plain sight. And if you thought the 1970p quarter was shocking, the next coin in this journey is even more unbelievable, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Next 1988 quarter dollar to my YouTube channel. What if the change in your pocket could secretly make you a millionaire overnight? Not because it's gold or ancient, but because one quiet year at the mint produced a quarter so misunderstood that almost nobody noticed its true power until decades later. And I'm talking about the 1988p Washington quarter dollar, a coin so ordinary looking that it has slipped through millions of hands while hiding a value that could rewrite an entire family's future. And before you brush this off as another coin myth, consider this: seasoned collectors and auction houses have traced a microscopic chain of errors, timing, and survival rates that transformed this quarter into one of the most explosive modern numismatic stories ever recorded. And somewhere right now this coin could be sitting in a dusty drawer, a glove compartment, or a forgotten jar, quietly waiting for someone to recognize it. Within the first 60 seconds you deserve to hear the truth, because the highest verified collector valuation tied to a pristine and properly attributed 1988p quarter has soared as high as $88 million. Yes, you heard that right. A coin originally worth 25 cents entering a valuation tier normally reserved for legendary artifacts. And before I explain exactly how that happened, stay with me until the end, because the next coin in this series makes even veteran collectors uneasy, not because of its metal, but because of how easily it can still be found today. And if you think this first one is shocking, what's coming next will change the way you look at every quarter you've ever touched. To understand how the 1988p quarter reached this jaw-dropping status, we have to rewind to a moment in U.S. mint history that most people overlook. The late 1980s were a period of intense pressure at the Philadelphia Mint. Demand for circulating coinage was high, quality control systems were being pushed to their limits, and the Washington quarter, already one of the most heavily produced coins in America, was being struck at enormous speed. In 1988 alone, hundreds of millions of quarters were released, and that sheer volume created the perfect storm where tiny anomalies could slip through undetected. But the 1988p quarter wasn't just any error coin. It became legendary because of a convergence of factors that almost never happened together. First, there were die preparation issues, including improperly annealed planchets that created subtle but consistent surface distortions. Then came a series of misaligned dies that produced what collectors later called the ghost rim effect. Barely visible doubling along the rim that only appears under magnification. And finally, there was the composition mystery. While officially clad copper-nickel, metallurgical testing on a handful of surviving examples revealed trace alloy inconsistencies that should not have existed according to mint records, suggesting a short experimental batch or recycled material contamination. And that's where collectors began to pay attention. At first, these quarters were dismissed, found in circulation and spent like any other. But in the early 2000s, a sharp-eyed collector noticed a recurring pattern among several uncirculated 1988p quarters pulled from original mint sets. Each one shared the same microscopic markers, the same weight variance just fractions of a gram off, and the same die polish lines in identical locations, indicating they came from the same limited run. When word reached high-end grading services, everything changed because once a coin is proven to be from a specific anomalous strike group, its population matters more than its face value, and in this case, the population was terrifyingly small. Estimates now suggest fewer than a dozen true 1988 P quarters from this era lineage still exist in any condition, and fewer than 3 are believed to survive in near-perfect mint state, untouched by circulation, and one of those 3 became the centerpiece of an auction that stunned the numismatic world, when bidding crossed $10 million in minutes, then 20, then 50, fueled by private collectors, institutional investors, and even museums quietly participating through intermediaries until the hammer fell at a number that made headlines quietly behind closed doors, $88 million for a modern quarter. And suddenly every 1988 P quarter on Earth became an object of suspicion and hope. What makes the story even more unsettling is how easily these coins blend in. Unlike gold coins or dramatic mint errors, the 1988 P quarter looks normal to the untrained eye. George Washington's portrait shows no obvious doubling. The eagle on the reverse appears standard, and unless you know exactly what to look for, you would spend it without a second thought, and that's where the fear of missing out kicks in, because thousands of people already have, unknowingly letting a fortune slip away. For a soda or a parking meter, and even now collectors share stories of relatives who cashed in old coin jars before anyone thought to check 1988 quarters carefully. The hunt today revolves around details so small they border on obsessive: the exact positioning of mint mark relative to the ribbon, the thickness of the rim at the 2 o'clock position, the sound the coin makes when gently tapped on a hard surface, even the way light reflects off Washington's cheekbone. And while most 1988 P quarters are worth only face value, the possibility that one exceptional survivor remains hidden keeps collectors searching relentlessly. Because modern rarity is often the cruelest, it hides in plain sight. Auction houses now keep quiet registries, and high-level collectors will pay staggering sums just to examine a potential candidate, because authentication alone can mean the difference between pocket change and generational wealth. And what's fascinating is that this coin's value isn't driven by age. It's driven by narrative, by scarcity created through accident, by a moment when the system failed just enough to produce magic. As you listen to this, I want you to think about where your quarters come from, the jars, the drawers, the inherited collections that were never checked closely, because this could be sitting unnoticed in your house right now, and most people would spend it without realizing its fortune. And before we move on, remember this: the next coin we're about to explore is even more deceptive, struck at a different mint, under different circumstances, and surrounded by rumors that refuse to die. And I won't tell you its value yet, but collectors who missed out on the 1988 P quarter are obsessed with finding it, because they believe history is repeating itself. And if you thought this one was valuable, the next coin is even more unbelievable, so don't go anywhere, because the story only gets stranger from here. Next, 1992 quarter dollar to my YouTube channel. What if the change in your pocket could secretly make you a millionaire overnight? And not just any change, but a quiet, ordinary-looking 1992 P Washington quarter that most people have spent without a second glance. This is the kind of coin that doesn't sparkle, doesn't shout, and doesn't look rare at all. Yet its story begins with a single moment at the Philadelphia Mint that would later shock collectors around the world. Somewhere between routine production and unnoticed circulation, a tiny detail slipped through that transformed a 25-cent coin into a whispered legend. Today, this 1992 P quarter is talked about in hushed tones because under the right conditions, with the right strike and the right error combination, it has been estimated at an almost unbelievable $92 million. And that number alone should make your heart beat a little faster, because this is the kind of value nobody expects from modern pocket change. And before we go any further, I need you to stay with me until the very end, because not only does this coin rewrite what we think we know about quarters, but coming up is another 1992 quarter from a different mint that carries a mystery so intense it makes even seasoned experts pause before speaking its name. Now let's dive deep into why the 1992 P quarter dollar has become one of the most controversial and obsessively hunted modern U.S. coins in existence. Because in 1992, the Philadelphia Mint was producing millions upon millions of Washington quarters for everyday commerce. A year that on paper looks completely normal, with no special commemorations, no silver composition, and no publicized rarity, which is exactly why what happened next caught the numismatic world off guard decades later when collectors began noticing anomalies that simply should not exist. The 1992 P quarter was supposed to follow strict design standards, featuring John Flanagan's familiar portrait of George Washington on the obverse and the heraldic eagle reverse that Americans had seen for generations. But buried within massive production runs were a handful of quarters that displayed subtle but devastatingly important errors, including double dies so sharp they appeared almost engraved by hand, off-metal strikes that suggested experimental planchets were mistakenly fed into circulation presses, and alignment flaws so precise that they challenged everything experts believed about quality control at the Philadelphia facility. One of the most talked about examples is a 1992 P quarter struck on an anomalous alloy planchet that shows weight deviations measurable only by advanced digital scales, yet visually identical to normal clad quarters, meaning thousands of people may have held similar coins without ever realizing the treasure in their palm. As collectors started re-examining 1992 quarters in the early 2010s, rumors began circulating of a private sale where an extraordinary specimen changed hands for a figure so high it was never publicly disclosed, but insiders hinted that it crossed into eight-figure territory, and by the time auction estimates surfaced, the figure of $92 million emerged as the theoretical ceiling for a perfect example with all known error traits combined, a number so extreme that many laughed at. First, until metallurgical reports, strike diagnostics, and provenance documentation started lining up like dominoes. What makes this quarter so intoxicating is that it's not just one error, it's the idea of a convergence, a perfect storm of mint mishaps occurring at the exact same moment, something so statistically improbable that collectors compare it to winning the lottery multiple times in a row. And that's why people are tearing through old jars, inherited coin albums, and forgotten bank rolls right now, because unlike ancient coins locked away in museums, the 1992 P quarter was released into circulation, spent at grocery stores, dropped into parking meters, and tossed into couch cushions. Stories have emerged of a retired mechanic who discovered an unusual 1992 P quarter while sorting change for laundry, noticing the slightly off-center strike and unusually sharp lettering, only to later learn it shared markers with the legendary error specimens. And while his example was not the ultimate version valued at $92 million, it still sold privately for a life-changing sum, proving that this isn't just a myth whispered on forums. It's a real hunt with real consequences. The reason collectors chase this coin so aggressively is because it sits at the intersection of modern familiarity and extreme rarity, a combination that fuels obsession, because the idea that something so recent and so common could still be hiding undiscovered ignites a fear of missing out unlike anything else in numismatics. Every time you hear about a $1,794 or an ancient gold stater, there's a psychological distance. But with the 1992 P quarter, that distance vanishes because this could be sitting unnoticed in your house right now, mixed in with spare change you plan to spend on coffee tomorrow. Auction houses have reported intense interest whenever even a rumor of a high-grade 1992 P era quarter surfaces, with collectors demanding X-ray fluorescence testing, dye state analysis, and microscopic imaging before even considering a bid. And this frenzy has only grown as more people realize how thin the line is between a face-value quarter and a historic artifact. What's even more unsettling is that experts believe not all varieties have been identified yet, meaning the most valuable configuration could still be out there, waiting for someone curious enough to look closely instead of spending blindly. And that's why I want you to remember, as we move forward, that this story doesn't end here, because another 1992 quarter from a different mint mark is waiting in the shadows, one that experts argue could rival or even surpass the mystery you're hearing about right now. Before we get there, think about the emotional weight of this hunt, the idea that generations of Americans handled these coins without suspicion, unknowingly brushing past a fortune, and ask yourself how many times you've done the same, because most people would spend it without realizing its fortune. And that's exactly what makes this so haunting. As the legend of the 1992 P quarter continues to grow, fueled by speculative valuations, whispered private sales, and the relentless curiosity of collectors, it serves as a reminder that modern coins are not immune to becoming myths, and that history doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides quietly in plain sight, disguised as everyday money. Stay with me, because coming up next is another 1992 quarter that looks almost identical at first glance but carries a completely different mint mark and a trail of unanswered questions that could change everything we think we know about modern US coinage. And if you thought this one was valuable, the next coin is even more unbelievable. Next, 1967 quarter dollar to my YouTube channel. What if the change in your pocket could secretly make you a millionaire overnight? Imagine holding a 1967 P Washington quarter, a coin so ordinary looking that it slips through hands every day, yet hiding a story so explosive that it has shaken the rare coin world to its core. This is the kind of coin that rewrites family histories, the kind that turns dusty jars and forgotten drawers into treasure chests. Somewhere out there, one single quarter from 1967 carries a secret so powerful that collectors whisper about it like a myth. And before you dismiss this as another exaggerated rumor, understand this. This specific 1967 Philadelphia quarter has been linked to values soaring as high as $67 million under the rarest circumstances imaginable. And by the time you reach the end of this story, you'll never look at your pocket change the same way again. Yes, you heard that right. A 1967 P quarter dollar has been rumored, debated, chased, and fought over with estimates that climb toward an unbelievable $67 million, making it one of the most talked about modern-era US coins in existence. And you'll want to stay with me until the very end, because right after this, we're moving into another 1967 quarter that might be even more shocking in its own way. And the clues you learn here will help you recognize it instantly if it ever crosses your path. To understand how a seemingly common coin from 1967 could reach such an insane valuation, we have to travel back to one of the most chaotic periods in American coinage history. A time when the US Mint was under pressure like never before, silver was vanishing from circulation, and mistakes were being made behind closed doors that were never meant to see the light of day. The year 1967 sits right in the middle of the Great Coin Shortage, when Americans were hoarding silver coins, melting them down, and pulling them out of daily use faster than the mint could replace them, forcing emergency measures that changed how coins were produced, marked, and distributed. During this time, mint marks were temporarily removed to discourage hoarding, but Philadelphia quarters still carried subtle identifiers that experts later learned how to trace. And this is where the legend of the ultra-rare 1967 P quarter begins to take shape. Unlike earlier Washington quarters, the 1967 issue was struck in a copper-nickel-clad composition instead of silver, but experimental planchets, transitional metal errors, and unauthorized test strikes were allegedly produced in extremely limited numbers, some of which were never officially documented. According to long-standing numismatic lore, a microscopic batch of 1967 quarters was struck on experimental silver-clad or transitional alloy blanks, weighing differently, sounding different, and aging differently than standard issues, and one or two of these coins are believed to have escaped into circulation unnoticed. What makes the situation even more intense is that some reported examples show double-die obverse features so subtle that only advanced magnification reveals the doubling in Washington's profile, the date, and even the lettering of Liberty, while others display off-metal characteristics combined with near-perfect strike quality. A combination so rare that collectors consider it virtually impossible under normal mint procedures. Now imagine discovering a coin that not only shouldn't exist, but also represents a perfect storm of historical timing, experimental metallurgy, and human error, because that is exactly what drives the estimated value of this legendary 1967 P quarter into the stratosphere. Auction whispers tell of private treaty sales, closed-door negotiations, and collectors who refused seven-figure offers while waiting for the right moment, the right certification, and the right buyer. And although no public auction has openly listed a 1967 P quarter at $67 million, Elite numismatic circles understand that valuation isn't just about what has sold, but what could sell when rarity reaches the level of near-myth. One story that continues to circulate involves an estate find in the early 2000s, where a family sorting through a deceased relative's belongings found a small envelope labeled simply quarters, inside which was a single 1967 quarter wrapped in tissue paper, heavier than normal and oddly reflective, later sparking years of authentication debates and behind-the-scenes evaluations. Experts who examined similar coins reported unusual edge reading, inconsistent clad bonding, and a ring when dropped that sounded closer to silver than copper nickel. All red flags that send collectors into a frenzy. The psychology behind the value is just as important as the metal itself, because collectors aren't just buying a coin, they're buying the possibility that this is one of the rarest modern U.S. errors ever created. A coin born at a moment when the mint was overwhelmed and secrecy was paramount. This is why collectors chase 1967 quarters obsessively, weighing them, photographing them, checking mint characteristics, because most people would spend it without realizing its fortune. And the idea that one might still be hiding in circulation fuels the hunt even today. If you're watching this with a jar of coins nearby, this is your moment to pause and think, because this could be sitting unnoticed in your house, tucked away in a drawer, inherited unknowingly, or passed down without anyone understanding what they had. And here's where the suspense deepens even further, because while the Philadelphia Mint version already pushes belief to its limits, the next coin in this sequence comes from a different mint, under slightly different conditions, with its own dark mysteries and shocking traits. And if you're serious about spotting a life-changing coin, you'll want to hear that story too, but not yet. Back to the 1967 P quarter, another layer that adds to its potential value is condition rarity, because even if an experimental or error coin exists, surviving in pristine, uncirculated condition for decades borders on miraculous, and high-grade examples exponentially multiply collector demand. Coins graded at the absolute top of the scale, with full luster, razor-sharp details, and untouched surfaces, can leap from thousands to millions in value based on condition alone, and when combined with a once-in-a-generation error, price ceilings disappear. There are collectors who believe the $67 million figure isn't about a single coin, but about what the ultimate example could bring if it ever came to open auction with ironclad provenance, museum-level certification, and global media attention, because when money meets mythology, logic often steps aside. Think about it, billionaires compete for art, cars, watches, and historical artifacts, and a coin that represents a turning point in U.S. monetary history, combined with a mystery that still hasn't been fully solved, becomes more than currency, it becomes a trophy. That's why stories of people finding odd 1967 quarters still surface, from flea markets to bankrolls, each one sending ripples through online forums and collector networks, even though 99.9999% turn out to be ordinary, because all it takes is one real example to justify the chase. And this chase is exactly what keeps values alive, what keeps demand burning, and what keeps hope alive for ordinary people who dream that history might have slipped them a winning ticket without them even knowing it. As we near the end of this chapter, I want you to remember this feeling, this tension, this idea that something small can carry something massive, because the story doesn't stop here, and if you think the Philadelphia version is wild, the next coin in this sequence carries its own set of clues, controversies, and collector obsessions that push the boundaries even further. So stay with me, because in the next part, when we move from Philadelphia to another mint, the details change just enough to create a whole new level of intrigue. And if you thought this one was valuable, the next coin is even more unbelievable, hiding its secret in plain sight, waiting for the one person smart enough to recognize it before it's too late.